Welcome. Today, another video in our series about the unified path. The unified path being a way to look at a spiritual life, maybe your spiritual life, in light of what we've learned about spiritual paths from all of the great saints and sages of history. And what we've learned is that a spiritual path needs to address all of ourselves. It needs to be holistic. And that involves addressing what we call the body, the mind, the heart, and the soul. All of these elements need to be addressed and in harmony in order to have a whole and productive spiritual path and spiritual life. This last element, the soul as we call it, is our connection with being, our connection with transcendence. And this soul element is something that needs to be addressed, fostered, savored, understood, and assimilated. And there are several approaches to doing that. One of the ones that has worked for me and that I enjoy is called the direct path. And today we have as a guest my good friend Dr. Greg Goode, who is one of the great advocates of the direct path and has 4 books in print on the topic. And I'm very, very glad to have Greg here in conversation. Greg, welcome.
Thank you, Terry. Glad to be here.
Can you give us a quick summary or situate the direct path in terms of spiritual paths?
It's like a distillation or a spin-off or a subset of Advaita Vedanta. And it's in terms of the yogas of Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Raja Yoga, and Jnana Yoga. It would be the last, the Jnana Yoga, or like the yoga of knowledge. And it focuses on knowing our true nature, which is nothing but pure, clear, brilliant, objectless awareness.
Uh-huh. I like this notion very much of the direct path being Jnana Yoga because as I've been talking about the unified path, Jnana is that element of soul here. But you also mentioned the other yogas, which are loosely translated, the other elements of the unified path, body, mind, and heart, or Bhakti, Raja, Jnana, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a pretty good mapping across you can make from the yogas to the elements. And the direct path keeps pretty much within the bounds of the jnana, the knowing part, what the unified path would call the soul part.
Uh-huh. One of the things that I think distinguishes the direct path is that it doesn't have any cosmology or metaphysical element. Mm-hmm. Do people like that? Is that disconcerting?
I think they like it. I think they've heard cosmologies before.
Certainly.
The traditions have them, they offer them, and they're quite useful for different kinds of things. But when you're
for those other elements,
for the other elements,
yes.
They're essential. In my own background, I found them very, very, very helpful.
As have I in my long journey.
And that my journey's been very long, too. But the direct path doesn't do those, and it doesn't set out to deconstruct them because they're not really part of what people's concerns are. It actually looks into what it is that they seem to be experiencing right now. And so people really don't have questions about the cosmology of how did the world begin. They might, but the direct path doesn't give you an account of those things.
Right. That's one of the things I find so refreshing about it. But I will say that in my experience, I've often found people who were absolutely preoccupied with the notion of, what is the right conception mm-hmm. of the cosmos and beyond that, to the point of, being almost violent about this view versus that view.
Absolutely. Those tend not to be the people who come to inquiry to learn the truth about their nature, the truth about the world. Uh-huh. Because if that's the kind of account they're interested in, the direct path doesn't provide any such account.
No.
In fact, it even deconstructs the very notion of causality. And you can't have a cosmology without a causality. So it's very unsatisfying if they're going for that kind of story or an account.
Yes, exactly. Rather, the direct path addresses those who are interested in a non-dual approach.
Mm-hmm. It certainly does.
How does the direct path fit into this world of non-duality?
Well, if you look at the world of non-dual teachings or non-dual meetings or non-dual videos or non-dual songs, it looks a lot like that. If you were to look at people and where they're sitting and who they're listening to and how the thing is conducted, it looks very much like a regular, like a satsang or a Western non-duality meeting. But the content is a little bit different. What is said is a little bit different. And it has a little bit more of a methodology, which is quite upfront about. It's quite explicit and sort of unashamed about having a methodology, which of course falls away before everything is over. So it doesn't matter that it has a methodology because it doesn't insist upon it and it doesn't hold it. But it does have a methodology, which is something that some non-dual teachings reject.
Yes, they reject them because it's a form or it's formalism.
Right, and if you really hold on to a methodology, then there has to be someone there holding on, and you sort of create a whole forest of dualities with that kind of thing.
Yes,
and so
that's
methods can do that. I mean, they can leave you with non-dual complexity. But since the direct path deconstructs its own methods, then it doesn't have to try to avoid using methods.
Well, I want to ask you about those methods in a moment, but another preliminary question. What keeps a non-dualist from becoming a fatalist, from becoming resigned to the fact that there's nothing to do?
Sometimes non-dualists or people who follow certain non-dual teachings do end up thinking that.
Well...
but how does one avoid that? The direct path avoids that because it doesn't look at anything as determined or as there's no causality happening in the direct path, according to the direct path.
Yes.
There's the background of awareness, and if there seem to be appearances at all, these appearances appear spontaneously. There's nothing pushing them or causing them. There's no genealogy of like if a color arises or a sound arises or a feeling arises, there's no sense in tracing back a genealogy or a causal process on that, because each step in the process is its own arising.
Yes.
And so it can't have a cause. If it had a cause, that cause would be another arising. But the ultimate destination for all those arisings and the ultimate source for them is awareness itself. So each one is more or less spontaneous, uncaused.
Yes, I see.
And so you can't have fatalism or determinism unless you have something determining something. And that doesn't happen in the direct path.
But there also has to be somewhere an element that encourages people to practice or move forward or to know, rather than just giving up and saying, well, there isn't anything.
What inspires one to do that in direct path terms is the fact that awareness is also love. And love is that yearning part, even if you understand it as a kind of semi-erotic part, it's something that draws you towards something you feel there's something you want to go towards, however you characterize that, and the ultimate source of that is the sweetness of awareness. And that, like in the Vedantic tradition, the awareness is Sat, Chit, and Ananda, the being, knowledge, and bliss or love.
Right.
And that would be the Ananda part.
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer. Yes, it's the Ananda part, the love that is this constituent element of
and
being.
It also helps prevent nihilism. Not only determinism, but nihilism, like the
Can
giving
you say
up.
more about that?
The nothing matters. There's no point in anything. I used to be a nihilist in my 20s.
You went through a phase as a nihilist?
I did went through a phase of nihilism, and it wasn't fun. It didn't feel good. Even though I felt like I had a really cool, correct philosophy, it wasn't fulfilling. And it had no element. It had no element towards which the heart yearns, towards which the heart
Right.
turns. You know, like a plant turns towards the sun.
Right.
There was nothing like that.
Now, you know, knowing you, I'm sure that in your nihilist phase, you gave it a lot of thought and consideration deeply for a long period of time.
I did.
I know that must be true about you. What is it that turned you away from nihilism?
In my own case, there were two things. One thing was the philosophy of idealism, that which explains the world is ideational. I read this very long book called The Nature of Thought by Brand Blanchard. It's almost 1,200 pages long. And he was arguing against every single modernist or materialist philosophy that he could find. And his arguments against them were better than their arguments against idealism. That got rid of the physicalism of nihilism. Sometimes nihilism thinks that the only thing that is out there is physical stuff.
Oh,
and that can feel kind of
materialist,
depressing.
right.
And I was kind of a materialist until I read that. So that's one part that sort of saved me from a life of nihilism, is the idealistic part, that there's something that is intrinsic to the mind or to thought. That's what that theory is. It's not non-dualism. It's not, doesn't even try to be non-duality, but it's something that sort of lifted me from materialism. And the other part was something that was totally unexpected, had nothing to do with philosophy, and that was a spontaneous mystical experience I had in a Christian context. And it sort of bypassed all my philosophical defenses and guardrails and, you know, theories that I had built, and it was something that just worked on the intuitive and the heart-centered element.
That is so typical of classical mystical experiences, in which suddenly it cuts through all of the chaff and things are clear, and never mind anything else.
And it didn't have a doctrinal content at the time.
Right.
It just bypassed that. And it was totally surprising, totally unexpected, and I was an atheist at the time.
Oh my.
I was a philosophical, I was a committed atheist, I would argue for atheism, against theism.
Wow.
And that got past that, all that.
All in an instant.
4 minutes.
Right? 4 minutes.
Yeah. It was during a song that I'd heard at a Christian concert.
Wow.
Yeah.
4 minutes that changed your life.
It really was. I have no explanation for it.
Well,
and I don't
know.
Yeah,
one
of course, direct path, there's no explanation.
That's right, right. One doesn't have an explanation for these things.
Now, later, since it happened in a Christian context, I wanted more of the same. I sort of acquired a yearning for goodness. I'd never had that before in my life. I'd had a yearning towards kindness and open-hearted, loving treatment, orientation towards other people. I'd never had that before in my life either. No one had ever taught that you're supposed to have that to me.
Well, I certainly see and can understand that in a Christian context. But how does that work in a direct path context or a non-dual context? Where is goodness?
Goodness. If it's love, if it's being, if it's knowledge, it's also the source of goodness. That which is for us, that which is our destiny, our goal.
Right.
It's not a rule-based good. It's not a rule-based goodness. It's sort of a natural, intuitive goodness that has to do with our very nature.
Yes, with our very nature, with the nature of being and consciousness. It's the manifestation of that ananda element.
Yes, and it's not that you end up saying, "Well, I've found the truth, and therefore I am good." It's in the Vedantic sense. You'd explain that by saying it's the antidote to badness.
Okay.
It removes badness and it removes nothingness.
That's because badness is not as real as goodness.
Right. As you go up, you go towards the more of the good, the more of the being, the more of the knowledge, and the more of towards love. Wonderful.
So, in the direct path, what is the regular process? And I say regular because when I talk about the unified path, one of the things I stress is the need for regularity in terms of our exercise of the body, mind, heart, and soul. And here we are with this soul element, with the direct path. And I'd like to see how you make it a regular component of life, rather than just a philosophy or an idea.
Right. And the direct path, in the direct path teachings, it's taught that to the extent that it seems like philosophy, it shouldn't be done theoretically. It should be done for transformation. It should be done, like Sri Atmananda said, the idea was that we have some line of thought that takes us to realization. So it doesn't have to be a theory or correct. So it doesn't matter whether your theory agrees with someone else's theory or your theory is more correct. It's not about that. It's about whether it takes you towards realization. So,
Right.
In my case, I'll talk about my case and I'll talk about how it might be different. In my case, every moment that I wasn't otherwise occupied, because I had the entire time that I was ever inquiring, I had a full-time job, 60 hours a week for decades.
Wow.
So there were evenings, weekends, and vacations that I had free time. And almost all the time, my mind would instantly and sort of naturally go towards what I was inquiring about. So for me, that engagement with what we call the direct path was inquiry.
Right.
And for example, for 1 year, I would inquire about where's my identity retained? What is it that I am, and where is it stored?
All
like
right.
If there's a place that keeps it, like between one day and the next, if there's deep sleep in between, what is it that guarantees that I wake up the same person who went to sleep? Because I wasn't maintaining my identity during that deep sleep moment. I wasn't at that time. So what was it that guaranteed? Because I thought that my identity was a person. So I thought, well, what makes me the same person?
Right.
So that's why I had this question. What is it that makes me me, and what is it that makes me a person? And it wasn't just me-centric. It was for anyone. What makes it identity in general?
Sure, that would have to translate to everyone. And
Yeah.
I'm sure many people have the very same question.
Yeah. For me, what made it regular was I was naturally drawn to it. But let's say you're not naturally drawn to it. Let's say that it's something that you find may be effective and you find it maybe works for you, but you're not so drawn to doing it. For me, it was regular because I loved it.
That helps a lot.
But let's say that I don't feel that way about it, well, I would treat it like a meditation session where it's always recommended that you do it in the same time, in the same place every day, or every day that you do it. Once a day is good, but definitely several times a week. I would also do it while I was taking walks, or actually even jogging. Sometimes I could do it, or driving. I could.
And the it you are doing is inquiry.
Inquiry. Like, what is it that, is it possible that there is some kernel of thought that I rediscover that provides my identity for me? Or is there a function buried deep in the mind somewhere where that function is going whether I know it or not, and it's kind of keeping my identity constant over time? So I was looking into questions like that. Those were the theories I thought, do they make any sense? And so querying whether they make sense is the inquiry. That was the inquiry I was doing. That's an example of 1 year I was doing just that question. So treat that as a meditation. If you do your Zazen meditation, or you do whatever meditation you do day by day, do it and devote it to that inquiry.
Yes.
So that's how you could keep it regular. There's other things the direct path does too, like the idea of standing as awareness, and that is, the direct path teaches us that we are this clear, pure consciousness.
You have a book by that name, I believe.
I do. Yes. And it came from Atmananda, and it's something that you do, and it's kind of like a scientific, it's a little bit like a visualization, it's a little bit like an affirmation, but it's more like a hypothesis testing. You know you are awareness, because it doesn't really make sense that you're anything else, because those things don't last. But awareness is never not there. So that's what you are. Okay, so I hear that. I don't quite feel it in my bone. I don't really quite get it, but I know that's the truth is going to end up being something like that. So what do I do about it? Well, I can do the standing as awareness idea where, okay, let's say that I really am awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Be awareness, that my true nature is awareness. Now, examine your experience and see if it verifies your stand as awareness. See if you can find some kind of counterexample or some kind of disqualifying moment that proves that you're wrong.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
And for example, let's say that I stubbed my toe and there's pain.
Right.
Well, awareness doesn't feel pain. Well, did you really feel pain, or did pain arise?
Mm-hmm.
And were you the knower of pain, the observer of pain?
I see.
Or was pain an object that arose to the subject being awareness? Do you want to say
Certainly.
that I, as awareness, felt pain, and so awareness does feel pain? Well, no, that's because we know going in that it won't be anything like that.
Right. Because
So if I am awareness, I can't feel pain.
right.
Pain might arise, might not, but if it arises, there's nothing that makes it mine, and there's nothing that makes it actually pain either. Because pain doesn't self-identify as pain.
No.
Nothing makes it pain except maybe a thought that may follow that says, hey, that was pain.
Besides, pain would necessarily be a change in condition of some kind, and awareness doesn't change conditions.
Right. And so if awareness can't be pain, because pain comes and pain goes. Awareness is there no matter what.
Yes. That's clear and true and beautiful.
So that's another thing that you can do in a regular basis. So I would say that a way to connect it to your life, to make it regular, to answer your first question about that, was to treat it like you would treat meditation.
Uh-huh.
Make it regular in that sense.
Right. And I like the tips that you give for meditation sessions about being in the same place at the same time, or things that reinforce that regularity.
Yeah.
That's all very valuable.
And sometimes you would go on, like, this is not so regular, it happens less often, but sometimes you can treat yourself to your own kind of retreat, an urban,
take a weekend?
an urban monastic retreat. Take a weekend off, or take a couple days off from work if one was working, and just stay home and do that stuff, do that inquiry, do the standing as awareness.
Makes a lot of sense.
Or if sometimes inquiry is actually listening to spiritual talks in a very concentrated, focused way to try to stay with the reasoning that they take you through.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of do that on yourself as you hear it, or shortly after you hear it. It doesn't always have to be something that you're generating on your own.
No,
you have to learn about
no.
these things somewhere. So you learn about them and you do that as you hear them. That can be something you do regularly as well.
That's a constituent part of the unified path. We call it, working with the mind.
Yeah.
Learning these things, learning to focus on those things, and learning what's between the times when you focus on it. What is this silence?
Yeah.
When I think about the direct path, and I think about a lot of the spiritual seekers and travelers I know, one of the problems I see is that they often get caught in the conception, and they want to deal with things conceptually because it's so satisfying, or because you can get to answers that way. But finally, it can't be about conceptions.
Right.
It has to be about understanding the nature of experience, which fundamentally is awareness.
Right.
But how do you help people make that transition, or defocus from the conceptual onto the existential?
Well, in the direct path, a concept is not really a concept. It's some kind of arising. Sri Atmananda calls them, whatever happens to you, sometimes he says they're thoughts, sensations. He just uses the term thoughts for everything.
All right.
So let's say that there's an experience of color arising, and an experience of sound arising, and maybe an experience of memory, like like an image arising. And let's say a thought like, my path is the truest path there is. Okay, let's say that arises, okay? So there's different kinds of arisings, and what really makes them different from each other? Like, you might say, what makes a sound different from a color? Well, usually the reason is that sound's linked to the ears, color's linked to the eyes, and a thought is linked to the mind. But in the direct path, perhaps by the time you get to working on conceptuality, you've already worked through with the world, and seen it nothing but awareness, the body, and seen it to be nothing but awareness. So then if you're to the point where you're working on concepts, hopefully, if you go in the order that the direct path proceeds in, you will have had lots and lots of insights about those other aspects of experience. So when you get to thoughts, you'll see that there's nothing really like a mind there. There's certainly no cranium or head. So what is it that you can link the notion of a thought to make it be a thought? Why is it a thought instead of just something that arises?
Okay.
And another way to deconstruct the notion of thought is that a thought usually claims to have an object. A thought, there's something that a thought seems to be about.
That's in the nature of thought. One thinks that, yes.
Yes, one does think that.
It's the object of this thought.
And by the time you've thought about, by the time you're there working on the nature of conceptuality, you might have realized that, say I'm thinking about a chair, okay. If I realize that there's no chair, then a thought can't be a thought, and the thought of a chair cannot be a thought, because there's no chair to be a thought of. So if there's no verification for the object of the thought, what makes it a thought in the first place?
Right. And
so there's nothing linking it to anything else that identifies it uniquely and definitely as a thought. Now, this is not to say nobody should think or anything like that.
No,
it's just when one is looking into the nature of thought to see whether it's really what it's cracked up to be, one sees that it's, the closer you look, the more it starts falling apart.
Right.
So when you start looking into the very process of conceptuality like this, then it takes a little bit of the starch or the air out of your insistence that you have better thoughts than someone else.
I see.
Because it can't, because it's a non-duality, it can't be, it's just impossible. It just cannot be a matter of having the correct thought. Because if you have a correct thought, you've already got lots of dualities going.
Yes.
You're embedded in the subject-object duality. You're embedded in the notion of a multiplicity of thoughts and things like that. So that cannot be the answer.
No, that's clear.
Yeah.
That's clear. In terms of learning the direct path, I won't use the word progressive, but I believe one starts with things that are more apparent, like physical.
Yes.
And then
it goes from the gross to the subtle. So
I wish I'd said that.
It goes from the world to the body to the mind to subtle objects that we seem to be thinking of, like even things like time, space, causality, inference, mathematics, things like that are all fair game to be looked into by the direct path. But why does it start at the body? Well, I think for two reasons. One is that the body, because that's the way Sri Atmananda sort of does it. The direct path, like the way I've put it together in my book, is sort of like a big, long unfolding of Atmadarshan, of Sri Atmananda's book. And so he starts off with, the world, basically. He's not as crisp about it as I am in that book, but in my book, but starts off with the world. So why to start there? Well, the world is easy to think about, like when Dr. Johnson tried to refute George Berkeley. He kicked a rock and said, "I refute Berkeley thus," and he kicked a rock. So we think, that's easy to think about. It's easy to grasp onto. So start there. It's easier to get that as an object of inquiry in mind. Okay. And one other reason. If you're able to deconstruct the notion of physicality, externality, then you've already deconstructed a lot of how we think about the mind anyway, because we think about the mind in metaphors that are themselves physicalistic.
Yes, that's right.
A veil of the
that
mind,
way.
veil, things covering things blocking things.
Connections
Hiding
of the mind.
things.
Yes, that's right.
So if you see that, say that you've discovered that there's no such thing as objective literal physicality, then those are even more obviously metaphors. And if they're metaphors only, we're freed from thinking of them as though they were physical objects. But just because, and now I have to say this because this is, when people pick up a direct path book or something like that, they look at the beginning and they say, "Oh, this is about the world. This asks me to think about like teacups and apples and oranges and bells ringing and stuff like that. That's so boring. I want to think about feelings, and I want to think about my identity. I might really think about free will." Is what I really think the action is. I want to think about that. So they skip forward and they do that first.
All right.
Inevitably.
All right. This is inevitably.
Inevitably, they can even go forward like that, but let's say that they're still thinking in physicalistic terms. Because they don't have the antidotes to those yet. They haven't seen through that yet. So to the extent that they're thinking in physicalistic terms, they'll have more and more trouble down the line.
Right. They won't have the tools that they should have learned back when they were dealing with the physical.
They won't have the background of the preparation too.
Right.
So inevitably, they'll have to go back and do the part they skipped.
Right. They want to get ahead at all.
Yeah. But I encourage them to start wherever that's comfortable. In my
Wherever
case, before I myself discovered the direct path, I had already been free of the notion of physicality for a couple decades. Through the idealist studies, and there was Berkeley and there was the gentleman Blanchard that I mentioned.
Yes.
That was already my situation before I even got to the direct path. So that was another reason that it's comfortable for me to start there, even more emphatically than maybe someone else would start there.
Well, I found the direct path to be a wonderful practice because I had been involved in several things that were really very conceptual, that were really about metaphysical reality and doctrines and cosmology, and the direct path doesn't have any of that.
Well, how did you find them? Did you find them useful?
I found them useful for a while, and they were very much part of my life for a while, but at some point I realized there's more to this, and that it was necessary to look beyond these conceptions. And there are undoubtedly ways outside of the direct path for doing that, but the direct path was immediately helpful to me, because what the direct path does is it allows one to immediately examine the experience that one is having. And there's experience itself is such a miracle that to be able to look at it and probe it and understand what it is and where it comes from is just a wonderful, liberating tool.
It is. And it's always, Sri Atmananda likes to say there's no roadblock, because anything that happens can be used to take you to the ultimate.
Yes,
so
that's right.
Summarizing something that, that maybe bothers you, or something that you like, or something that is notable. If you follow it, it always takes you straight to awareness, without detour.
Yes. Exactly.
Yeah, its nature is awareness, its destination and source is awareness. So anything can be used. Anything that's happening can be used.
Another thing I like about the direct path is it fits so well into what I call the unified path, because you were talking about dealing with the body. Well, that's clearly an element of ourselves that we need to deal with and understand, and the direct path is there. Although it might not be the focus of dealing with the body, but it is certainly there to help understand and assimilate that experience, as it is for the other stages of the unified path.
Yeah. Well, the body is a big deal in direct path. There's a whole a subsection of the direct path that has to do with looking, body awareness, body sensing, the yoga of awareness, where you can move the body, examine the body in different ways that seem like you're getting to the real objective truth of things. That seems like the body really exists on its own. Why? Because there's solid surface there. I can feel it, and if I hit it hard enough, it's painful. And usually, pain means real.
Yes. So pain has an insistence to it,
and we give it authority. It's real, realer than pleasure, or something like that. So you can move the body. You can explore, its movement, its various sensations, to see whether they are proof that the body is actually an objectively existing thing. And when it doesn't matter what the sensation or what the arising is, it's never anything other than awareness. And the closer you look, the easier it is to see that.
Yes, that's another thing I love about the direct path. The closer you look, the easier it is to see these things.
Right. And so whether it's movement, sometimes we think, well, if it moves, it has to be real. So you move the body in different ways. You can even move it until it becomes like you encounter resistance, as like a yogic move or something like that. Or even into a region of discomfort. Doesn't matter, because all those are nothing other than awareness.
Right. How could they be?
So they can't prove that seeing things, recognizing things as awareness is mistaken. They can't possibly prove that, because they themselves are awareness.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it's easy to say, yes, I get it, but it's quite something else to really existentially understand.
And to see that everything you do only goes to prove it, and doesn't
that's right.
Like
everything
disqualify
you do
it.
only goes to prove it.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Greg, thank you for the time to talk to me.
Oh, my pleasure.
I think this fits very well into what I've called the unified path, and I hope we can have another conversation about some of the other elements.
Oh, I do too. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Greg Goode, my good friend, who has 4 books on the direct path, and I'd like to recommend all of them.